Imagine waking up tomorrow morning to find out that the money in your bank account is, well, just meaningless ash.
Right. Completely worthless.
Yeah. And your profession, the career you have spent your entire adult life building, is suddenly classified as a capital crime.
It is a terrifying thought.
The religion you practice is banned. Its sacred buildings are just reduced to rubble. And simply wearing a pair of reading glasses or even just having soft hands is suddenly enough to warrant your execution.
It sounds like something out of a dystopian novel.
It does. But this isn't fiction. I mean, in April 1975, for millions of Cambodians, this actually became the law overnight.
It is a reality that, frankly, defies almost every foundational concept we have about how a human society functions.
Yeah, exactly.
When we study history, we're usually looking at the building of civilizations, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe their slow, steady decline over centuries. But what happened in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge was an instantaneous, deliberate demolition.
Which is why we are undertaking this deep dive today. It's a deeply serious, clinical, and I think empathetic examination of one of the most devastating national collapses in human history.
It is.
And I need to be completely upfront with you, the listener, right at the start. Today's deep dive is not going to have our usual tone.
No.
There is absolutely no room for cheerful banter or lighthearted tangents today. The mission of our discussion is to confront a history that is entirely murky, devastating, and just deeply difficult to process. We are looking at the Cambodian genocide.
Right, because between the years of 1975 and 1979, the Khmer Rouge, operating under the leadership of Pol Pot, ruled a country they renamed Democratic Kampuchea.
And we must immediately confront the central, staggering fact of that rule. In a span of just under 45 months, an estimated 1.5 to 3 million Cambodians were killed.
Yeah. I really want you to pause and absorb that number. 1.5 to 3 million people.
That represents approximately 1/4 of the country's entire population completely erased in just 4 years.
And I want to be clear about the mechanics of this, too, because this was not purely the collateral damage of battlefield casualties in a civil war.
Right. It wasn't just crossfire.
Exactly. This demographic collapse was achieved through systematic starvation, institutionalized torture, mass execution, forced labor, and the deliberate withholding of basic medical treatment.
The scale is almost incomprehensible. I mean, to contextualize it, the demographic collapse we are looking at has very few parallels in the history of global conflict.
You are looking at a clinical study of what happens when absolute, unyielding ideological purity is enforced upon a society without any regard whatsoever for human life.
Yeah.
The regime viewed the population not as citizens to be governed, but as raw biological material. Just stuff to be utilized and discarded in the pursuit of a utopian agrarian vision.
We often use metaphors to try and understand systemic failure, right? Usually when we attempt to diagnose a failure, there's an expectation of precision.
Like trying to find a broken part in a machine.
Exactly. You think of it like engineering or medicine. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points and says, well, there it is.
Right.
But when you look at Democratic Kampuchea, that x-ray analogy fails completely. They didn't just want to close a few corrupted programs or fix a broken bone. They wanted to completely wipe the hard drive of Cambodian society back to its absolute factory settings.
And corrupting every single file in the process. Your family, your job, your memories.
That concept of wiping the hard drive is precisely what the regime termed Year Zero. It was the literal attempt to restart time and human development.
And to understand how an entire nation was systematically dismantled like that, we have to synthesize a really vast and sobering array of historical records.
Which we're drawing from today.
Yes. We are using deeply moving survivor testimonies preserved by the USC Shoah Foundation, which give us the visceral, micro-level reality of living through this nightmare.
The day-to-day horrors.
Exactly. We are also examining comprehensive historical analyses of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, geographic and demographic studies, mapping the sites that became known as the killing fields, and the chillingly meticulous bureaucratic records salvaged from the Tool Sling prison.
Let's begin by looking at the architects of this abyss, because it's impossible to understand Democratic Kampuchea without understanding the men who actually engineered it.
Right.
And primarily we have to look at the man who became known to the world as Pol Pot. The origins of Pol Pot present a massive, almost absurd historical paradox, given what he would later do.
He was born in Salaf Sar in 1925 in a small village called Prikspavov in the Kampong Tom province.
Now, considering the ideology he would later force upon millions, an ideology that violently idealized the poorest, most uneducated rural peasants to the exclusion of all else, you would naturally assume he was born into deep agrarian poverty.
You'd assume his radicalism was born from a lifetime of starvation, right? Landless desperation.
Yes, exactly. But the historical reality is completely the opposite. Salaf Sar's upbringing was, by Cambodian standards of the early 20th century, highly privileged.
He was not a destitute peasant. His family was relatively affluent. I mean, they owned roughly 50 acres of rice paddy.
Which is huge.
To put that into perspective, that was nearly 10 times the national average for a Cambodian farming family at the time. This affluence provided him with a massive buffer against the harsh realities of rural life.
It afforded him opportunities that the vast majority of Cambodians could never even dream of. And the connections to the elite went even higher than just land ownership. He had direct ties to the Cambodian royal family.
Wait, really? The royal family?
Yeah, one of his older sisters was actually a concubine at the court of King Manavong. And when he was just 5 or 6 years old, he wasn't sent into the fields to work. He was sent to live with an elder brother in the capital, Phnom Penh.
And look at the education this supposedly ultimate agrarian revolutionary received. He spent a year immersed in traditional religious study at a Buddhist monastery. Following that, he was enrolled in a prestigious French Catholic primary school. He was receiving a highly colonial, deeply urban, and thoroughly bourgeois education.
His early life was characterized by deep exposure to the very institutions he would later seek to annihilate with absolute prejudice. Urban life, formal education, organized religion, and foreign cultural influence.
Yet for all this privilege, Salat Sar was not a brilliant student.
No, he really wasn't.
He struggled academically. He failed his entrance examinations for high school and was subsequently sent to study carpentry at a technical school.
But here again, his privilege insulated him from failure. Despite his mediocre academic performance, his connections and status secured him a government scholarship in 1949 to travel to France to study radioelectronics in Paris.
And post-war Paris is the true crucible of the Khmer Rouge. You have to picture the intellectual climate of Paris in the late 1940s and early 1950s.
It was intense.
It was a hotbed of political radicalism. They were recovering from the trauma of Nazi occupation and deeply embroiled in debates about colonialism, capitalism, and the future of global communism.
So Salaf Sar arrived in this environment and almost entirely ignored his studies in radioelectronics. In fact, he failed his exams 3 years in a row, which eventually led to him losing his scholarship.
But his time wasn't wasted. He was receiving a different kind of education. In 1951, he joined the French Communist Party.
And more crucially, he became a central figure in a secretive, highly influential group of Cambodian students studying in France known as the Circle Marxist, the Marxist Circle.
The Circle Marxist was an echo chamber of young left-wing Cambodian nationalists. These men would eventually form the absolute core leadership of the Khmer Rouge.
We are talking about figures like Ieng Sary, who would become the regime's foreign minister.
Right, and Khieu Samphan, who would become its nominal head of state, Sun Sen, the future defense minister, and Ho Yuan.
It is vital to recognize that, like Salaf Sar, these were young men from relatively privileged backgrounds. They were not laborers. They were studying law, economics, and literature at elite Parisian universities.
When you look at the academic work these men were producing at the time, you can see the blueprint for the genocide being drawn up right there in the university libraries.
Give me an example of that.
Well, Khieu Samphan, for example, wrote his doctoral thesis in 1959 on Cambodia's economy. His central argument was that Cambodia was being exploited by international capitalism and that the only way to achieve true independence was for the country to become entirely, ruthlessly self-reliant.
Ending all dependency on the developed world.
Exactly. And another member, Ho Yuan, wrote a thesis in 1955 arguing that the peasantry, rather than the urban working class prioritized by traditional Marxism, should be the central driving force in national development.
So they were taking the heavily Stalinist, authoritarian outlook of the French Communist Party of that era and fusing it with elements of Maoism, specifically the romanticization of the rural peasant and emerging anti-colonial theory.
But what is so fascinating, and ultimately so deeply tragic, is the profound, fatal disconnect between their academic theories and the physical reality of the country they were theorizing about.
I am stuck on a massive psychological and historical problem here. How does a group of leaders educated in Paris return home and decide that the only way to save their country is to destroy it?
It's a huge leap.
It is. How do you go from sitting in a Parisian cafe debating economics to orchestrating the murder of 2 million of your own people?
You bridge that gap through a concept that political historians refer to as voluntarism, and it is perhaps one of the most dangerous philosophical beliefs ever put into political practice.
Voluntarism. Okay, explain that.
Voluntarism is the radical belief that human willpower, pure revolutionary zeal, and absolute ideological purity can overcome all material, historical, and economic realities.
So it's the ultimate rejection of pragmatism.
Exactly. Mainstream orthodox Marxism generally argues that history progresses through inevitable material economic stages, from feudalism to capitalism to socialism and finally to communism. It requires industrialization and an urban working class.
But the Khmer Rouge leadership, infected by this extreme voluntarism, believed that if they simply willed it hard enough, if their revolutionary consciousness was pure enough, they could bypass all those intermediate, messy steps of development.
They believed they could instantly leap from a semi-feudal agrarian society to a pure, stateless communist utopia overnight.
And because they had spent their formative intellectual years in Europe, they were completely untethered from the daily, grinding realities of the very peasantry they idolized.
Precisely. They romanticized the peasant as a pure, uncorrupted revolutionary vessel. Because they lacked any real grounded experience with the agricultural reality of Cambodia, they were completely blind to the human cost of their theories.
They viewed society as a blank piece of paper that could be erased and redrawn at will.
They genuinely believed that by burning down the old society, completely destroying all its institutions, its culture, its economy, a new, perfect egalitarian society would instantly grow in its place.
One Khmer Rouge activist famously and chillingly stated, "We must burn the old grass so that new grass can grow."
Yeah. They didn't view the destruction as a necessary evil. They viewed the destruction as the actual mechanism of salvation.
And that theoretical echo chamber, built in the libraries of Paris, eventually found its horrific practical application in the streets of Cambodia's capital.
Which brings us out of the realm of theory and into the physical reality of what the Khmer Rouge called Year Zero.
Right. The date is April 17th, 1975. To understand the impact of that day, we have to set the stage. By April 1975, Cambodia had been enduring a brutal, destabilizing 5-year civil war.
It was a conflict between the U.S.-backed, right-leaning government of Lon Nol and the communist Khmer Rouge insurgency.
The countryside had been heavily bombed, the economy was in ruins, and Phnom Penh was swollen with refugees who had fled the rural fighting.
So when the black-clad Khmer Rouge forces finally entered and captured Phnom Penh on the morning of April 17th, effectively ending the civil war, the immediate reaction of many residents was actually relief.
Really? Relief?
Yeah, people cheered in the streets. They believed the years of fighting, the daily artillery shelling, and the immense chaos were finally over. They thought they were transitioning to peace.
But that relief lasted only a matter of hours. The reality of Year Zero was unleashed with a speed and ferocity that no one could have anticipated.
Instead of establishing a government to administer the capital or setting up a transitional authority, the Khmer Rouge High Command orchestrated the immediate forced evacuation of the entire city.
We are talking about a major metropolitan center. 2.5 million residents of Phnom Penh were ordered out of their homes.
And I want to dig into the logistics of this because how does a relatively small guerrilla army move 2.5 million people in a matter of hours?
They accomplished it through a combination of absolute terror and a massive coordinated deception.
Right. The Khmer Rouge soldiers went door to door, and the pretext they gave to the population was entirely false. They told the residents that the United States military was planning an imminent, massive B-52 bombing raid on the city.
They used the trauma of the recent war to panic the population. They told people they only needed to leave for 2 or 3 days.
They told them to leave their doors unlocked, assuring them that the Khmer Rouge would protect their property while they were hiding in the countryside.
And for those who hesitated or who saw through the lie, the illusion of benevolence was instantly dropped. Anyone who refused to leave, anyone who asked too many questions, or anyone who simply moved too slowly was shot dead on the spot.
Homes and businesses were set on fire just to force people out into the streets.
Survivor testimonies from the USC Shoah Foundation paint a picture of these evacuations that is practically apocalyptic. We have to remember that April is the height of the dry season. It is the absolute hottest month of the year in Cambodia, with temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit.
Millions of people were forced onto the roads on foot, packed together so tightly that movement was reduced to a crawl. Families were separated in the chaos. People had virtually no time to gather food, water, or necessary medication.
And the clinical brutality extended to the most vulnerable segments of society. The Khmer Rouge did not spare the hospitals.
No, they didn't. Every hospital across the city was completely emptied at gunpoint. Patients who were in the middle of surgeries, the elderly, amputees from the Civil War, women who had just given birth, they were all forced out of their beds and pushed onto the scorching asphalt.
If a patient could not walk, their family members were forced to push them in their hospital beds down the highway until the wheels broke, at which point they were simply left by the roadside to die.
It is estimated that 20,000 people died just along the exit routes out of the city during this initial evacuation phase. They died of heat stroke, dehydration, exhaustion, and summary execution.
At checkpoints established along the roads, heavily armed Khmer Rouge cadres methodically stripped the evacuees of their belongings, confiscating cars, motorcycles, jewelry, and any provisions they had managed to carry.
This mass displacement was not a temporary security measure despite the lies told to the populace. It was the deliberate, permanent geographic transformation of an entire country.
The ideology of the Khmer Rouge viewed the city itself and the concept of urban life as a parasitic disease feeding on the rural agrarian economy.
By emptying Phnom Penh and subsequently every other provincial city and town, they were instantly dismantling the urban power structure. They were destroying the capitalist economy by scattering its participants.
They were turning the entire nation into a vast, decentralized network of forced agricultural labor camps. That was the physical reality of year zero.
But the ideological reality, the psychological component of this reset, is even more terrifying.
Because year zero wasn't just about moving people from point A to point B. It was about severing the population's connection to reality itself.
The Khmer Rouge declared that all of Cambodian history prior to April 17, 1975, was corrupt, imperialist, and fundamentally invalid. They sought to abolish everything that tied a person to the modern world, to their community, or even to their own past.
Let's talk about the mechanics of how you actually erase a civilization. Because it required systematic destruction. They started with the economy. They abolished money entirely.
And that didn't just mean issuing a new currency. They physically raided the national bank in Phnom Penh. They blew up the vaults.
They drag all the paper currency and financial records into the streets and set them on fire. Suddenly, millions of reals were just paper blowing in the wind.
People used it to light fires or as toilet paper, because overnight, the concept of wealth, savings, and financial security was eliminated.
They outlawed private property. The concept of owning your own home, your own land, or even your own cooking pots was abolished. Everything belonged to the Angkar, the faceless organization of the Communist Party.
They banned all trade and commerce. Markets were closed and dismantled, and then they launched a total, uncompromising war on religion.
Democratic Kampuchea was declared an officially atheistic state, but it went far beyond simply removing religion from government. It was an act of eradication.
They systematically destroyed 132 mosques. They executed Islamic leaders and forced the Cham Muslim minority to eat pork or face immediate execution, a direct assault on their core spiritual identity.
And the majority Buddhist populations suffered immensely. The regime defrocked an estimated 50,000 Buddhist monks.
These men, many of whom were elderly scholars, were forced into hard labor in the rice fields. Temples were desecrated and turned into pigsties or ammunition depots.
The traditional Buddhist institutions that had formed the moral and social backbone of Cambodian village life for centuries were dismantled. They completely razed the Roman Catholic Cathedral in Phnom Penh, taking it apart stone by stone until there was nothing left but an empty field.
Christian clergy were hunted down and killed. Every single spiritual tether a person might have to seek comfort or community was criminalized.
So I have to ask, what does year zero actually mean for a person's identity when their entire family history and culture are declared illegal? I want you, the listener, to really put yourself in this impossible psychological space.
It's hard to even fathom.
Imagine waking up tomorrow and finding that your profession, whether you are a teacher, a software engineer, a doctor, or a musician, is now considered a parasitic crime against the state.
The religion you rely on for hope is banned. The very concept of your family living together under one roof, raising your own children, is viewed as a threat to national security.
Your entire identity, the sum total of your life experiences and choices, has been criminalized overnight.
The psychological terror of that realization is absolute. You are completely unmoored, And to enforce this new reality, to manage this newly displaced and traumatized population, the regime had to completely redefine human value.
They implemented a rigid, deadly, and entirely arbitrary categorization of the populace, dividing society into two primary classes, the base people and the new people.
This division is the foundation of the genocide. So let's break down these categories. Who were the base people?
Well, the base people, also referred to as the old people, were the rural peasants who had lived in areas controlled by the Khmer Rouge prior to the 1975 victory.
They were the ones who had endured the U.S. bombing campaigns and had lived under the insurgency's administration.
Right. And in the regime's twisted ideological framework, these people were the idealized vanguard of the revolution. Because they were largely uneducated and engaged in manual labor, they were considered uncorrupted by capitalism, foreign influence, and urban bourgeois life.
But did that mean they were safe?
Not entirely, no. But they were granted a slightly higher social status within the new totalitarian hierarchy. They were generally trusted more by the local Khmer Rouge cadres, they were sometimes given minor supervisory roles, and crucially, they occasionally received marginally better food rations.
However, they were still subjected to brutal labor conditions and lived in constant fear of the regime.
Yeah, but the true horror was reserved for the second category, the new people.
Right. These were the 2.5 million displaced urbanites from Phnom Penh, the professionals, the educated class, the merchants, and anyone who had any connection whatsoever to the former Lon Nol government.
The regime viewed the new people with absolute, unmitigated suspicion and hatred. They were seen as literal parasites.
The Khmer Rouge ideology dictated that the new people were fundamentally contaminated by Western capitalism, imperialism, and intellectualism. They were considered a hostile element that needed to be neutralized.
When the new people arrived at the rural agricultural communes after enduring the death marches from the cities, their nightmare only deepened. They were placed at the absolute bottom of the new social order.
They were given the most grueling, physically devastating labor, digging canals by hand, clearing dense jungle despite having no prior agricultural experience.
They received the smallest, most inadequate food rations, and they were subjected to constant paranoid monitoring by the cadres for any signs of rebellion, fatigue, or lingering bourgeois tendencies.
This systemic division and persecution lead us directly into a phenomenon that historians and sociologists classify as classicide.
Classicide.
Yes. We often think of political purges in history as targeting specific rival politicians, military leaders, or dissidents who actively speak out against a regime. But the Khmer Rouge waged a literal, proactive war on the intellect itself.
The sheer absurdity and arbitrary cruelty of the targets are what make this era so uniquely chilling. Execution wasn't reserved for people who took up arms against the state.
Execution was handed down for simply possessing traits that the regime stereotyped as belonging to the corrupt elite.
The Khmer Rouge systematically hunted down doctors, lawyers, engineers, and teachers. If you were discovered to have a university degree, you were killed.
If you spoke a foreign language, French, English, Vietnamese, you were executed, because it implied a connection to the outside world and a life beyond the rice paddy.
The regime's goal was total unbroken homogeneity. They wanted a perfectly uniform society of compliant agrarian laborers.
Anything that distinguished a person, any sign of individuality, specialized knowledge, or artistic expression, was viewed as a mortal threat to that uniformity. Musicians, writers, and artists were targeted and liquidated because art requires individual thought.
For anyone listening right now, it's almost impossible to wrap your head around the granular level of this paranoia. It went beyond your profession or your education. Even your physical traits became a death sentence.
People were executed simply because they wore glasses.
Wow. Just for wearing glasses.
Yeah, the logic was that if you wore glasses, it meant you spent your time reading books instead of working in the fields, which marked you as an intellectual.
And people were killed for having soft hands.
Yes. The enforcers would literally inspect the calluses on people's hands. If your hands were soft, it meant you had not spent your life performing manual agricultural labor. It meant you were a parasite who lived off the sweat of the peasantry.
It is a terrifying dystopian reality where the state murders you not for any action you have taken, but for possessing the basic passive attributes of a modern life. But how did the enforcers, the Khmer Rouge cadres, many of whom were very young, rationalize this? How do you look at a person with glasses and see a mortal enemy that must be bludgeoned to death?
You achieve that through intense indoctrination and the systematic dehumanization of the victim class. The cadres were taught that the new people were not fully human. They were enemies of the Angkar.
And this erasure of identity and humanity extended deeply into the very way people were allowed to communicate. The regime implemented radical linguistic reforms to restructure the way Cambodians thought.
This is one of the most fascinating and insidious aspects of the regime's control.
The Khmer language traditionally has a very complex, nuanced system of honorifics and pronouns. The words you use to address someone define your rank, your age relative to theirs, and your social status. It is a language built on respect and hierarchy.
The Khmer Rouge abolished all of that in an instant. They flattened the language.
They forced everyone, regardless of age or former status, to address each other as mit, which translates to friend or comrade.
Traditional signs of deference and respect, such as the sampi, the traditional greeting of pressing the palms together and bowing the head, were strictly banned.
You were no longer allowed to show respect to an elder or a teacher. Your only respect belonged to the state.
The regime also invented new, sterile vocabulary. They often drew from Pali or Sanskrit to force a new, revolutionary mindset, distancing the language from everyday colloquial Khmer.
They told the population they had to lot dam, which means to forge or hammer into shape a new revolutionary character.
They were relentlessly told they were merely instruments of the Angkar. You were not a person. You were a tool for agricultural production.
Perhaps the most haunting and psychologically devastating linguistic shift was the suppression of the word I.
Let's really think about that. They banned the first-person singular pronoun.
Exactly. People were forced to refer to themselves in the plural we, or simply refer to themselves by their revolutionary name in the third person.
This was a deliberate, calculated attempt to completely erase individual autonomy. If you cannot say I want, I feel, or I am, you begin to lose the conceptual framework of your own individuality. You exist only as a fraction of the collective whole.
And the psychological control didn't stop at vocabulary. The regime actually coined a medical term to criminalize human emotion. They called it memory sickness.
Memory sickness.
Yeah. If you expressed any nostalgia for your life before 1975, if you were caught crying over the loss of your home, if you mentioned the career you used to have, or if you showed visible sadness over the disappearance of a loved one, you were diagnosed with memory sickness.
And in democratic Kampuchea, the cure for memory sickness was execution.
The state demanded not just physical compliance, but total psychological submission. You were required to be enthusiastically joyful about the revolution at all times, even as you were starving to death.
By controlling language and criminalizing memory, they were attempting to control thought itself. But to ensure that this total loyalty to the Angkar was absolute and unchallenged, the regime had to eliminate the only institution that naturally competes with the state for a person's devotion.
They systematically attacked and dismantled the deepest human bond, the traditional family unit.
In the eyes of the Khmer Rouge, the extended family was a dangerous, competing source of loyalty. If a child loves their mother more than they love the Angkar, that child is a potential traitor.
Therefore, the family structure had to be destroyed in favor of absolute dependency on the state. But I'm stuck on another logistical problem here. If you're a totalitarian regime, you can control the borders, you can confiscate the food, and you can dictate the language.
Right.
But how on earth do you legislate the love between a parent and a child? How do you actually practically break that biological and emotional bond?
You do it through ruthless, physical separation and continuous indoctrination. Children as young as 7 or 8 years old were physically taken from their parents' arms.
They were removed from the communes and placed in segregated communal youth camps run entirely by hardened Khmer Rouge instructors.
The regime specifically targeted children because they believed children were a blank slate. They were pure, they had not been deeply corrupted by the pre-1975 capitalist society, and they could be easily molded into perfect instruments of the revolution.
In these youth camps, the state explicitly told the children that the Angkar was their true parent. Their biological parents were merely the physical vessels that brought them into the world, but the Angkar provided them with life, purpose, and direction.
The children were actively taught to spy on their parents when they were allowed brief visits. They were instructed to listen for any complaints about the food, any expressions of memory sickness, or any secret religious practices, and to report those infractions directly to the cadres.
And those reports often resulted in the parents being taken away and executed. The regime weaponized the innocence of children against their own families.
And for the adults, the regime sought to control the very future of the family by taking over the mechanisms of reproduction and marriage.
Sex outside of state-sanctioned marriage was strictly prohibited and was treated as a severe moral crime punishable by death.
The concept of romantic love, or choosing your own partner, was entirely abolished. Instead, the Angkor instituted a system of forced arranged marriages.
Survivor accounts detail these ceremonies, and they are incredibly grim. They were often conducted in mass ceremonies where dozens, sometimes hundreds of couples were married simultaneously in a sterile, bureaucratic setting.
In many cases, these marriages were between complete strangers, people who had never even spoken to each other before they were ordered to stand side by side.
The primary overt goal of these mass marriages was demographic. The regime needed to rapidly increase the population to build a massive agricultural workforce for the future.
But the secondary, more insidious goal was psychological control. By forcing marriages between strangers and often between people of different social backgrounds, forcing a new people woman to marry a wounded Khmer Rouge veteran, for example, they prevented the formation of deep, natural family bonds that could foster trust and eventual resistance.
The state literally mandated consummation of these forced marriages, and the couples were heavily monitored by spies who would listen outside their huts at night to ensure they were complying.
Everything, from the destruction of the word I to the forced mating of strangers, was meticulously designed to breed out family loyalty and individuality.
So if we take a step back and look at the society they have engineered by 1976, money is burned, the cities are empty, the intellectuals are dead or hiding their identities, language is restricted, and children are separated from their parents.
The entire population of Cambodia is now enslaved in a vast network of rural agricultural communes.
And this sets the stage for the regime's master economic plan. Because if you destroy the family unit and the modern economy, you still have the problem of biological survival. You still have to feed these people.
And that leads to the most mathematically impossible economic plan of the 20th century, which resulted in what is often called the silent famine.
The economic policy of the Khmer Rouge was officially titled the Moha Laut Plow, which translates to the Super Great Leap Forward.
As the name heavily implies, it was a direct, albeit vastly more extreme and accelerated, imitation of Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward in China, a policy that had previously caused the deaths of tens of millions through catastrophic famine.
The core tenet of this plan, championed by Khieu Samphan, was autarky, total, immediate, and uncompromising national self-reliance. The regime's prevailing slogan was, if we have rice, we can have everything.
The economic theory was brutally simple. By focusing the entire labor force of the nation, millions of newly enslaved urbanites alongside the peasantry exclusively on rice cultivation, they could generate massive, unprecedented agricultural surpluses.
The state would then export the surplus rice to other communist nations to buy the heavy machinery and weaponry needed for rapid industrialization and defense.
They believed this would allow them to entirely bypass any need for foreign assistance, international trade, or the slow intermediate stages of normal economic development.
But the mechanics of this policy were lethally flawed from the moment they were conceived, driven entirely by that dangerous concept of voluntarism we discussed earlier. The Central Committee in Phnom Penh demanded a nationwide agricultural yield of 3 tons of rice per hectare.
To understand why this is a death sentence, you have to look at the agricultural math. The historical average yield in Cambodia prior to the war in the Khmer Rouge, even in good weather, was only about 1 ton of rice per hectare.
So the regime was demanding a 300% increase in production literally overnight.
And they were demanding this, utilizing an exhausted, deeply malnourished workforce of former city dwellers, teachers, mechanics, shopkeepers who had absolutely no experience in rice cultivation.
They were working with primitive, handmade tools because modern farming equipment had been abandoned or destroyed. Furthermore, they were forced to build massive, poorly engineered irrigation canals designed by party cadres with zero engineering background,
Many of which simply collapsed or washed away during the monsoon season.
To attempt to meet these scientifically impossible quotas, the regime essentially transformed the country into a slave state. People were forced into labor gangs, working up to 16 hours a day in the fields, under the boiling sun or in torrential rain.
They often worked deep into the night under the moonlight. There were no wages, no days off, and no sick leave.
If you complained of exhaustion, if you collapsed, or if you simply refused to work, you were accused of possessing a bourgeois work ethic and you were executed.
But despite the terror, despite the 16-hour days, you cannot simply force the soil to produce 3 times its natural yield through willpower alone.
Right.
The quotas were impossible.
Uh.
And this is where the bureaucratic terror compounds the physical suffering, creating a catastrophic feedback loop.
The local Khmer Rouge cadres, the young men and women placed in charge of these communes, were terrified of the central leadership in Phnom Penh.
The atmosphere of paranoia meant that failure was equated with treason. If a local cadre reported back to Pol Pot that they had failed to meet the 3-ton quota, they would not be given fertilizer or assistance.
They would be accused of deliberately sabotaging the revolution. They would be taken away and killed.
So, faced with the reality of an impossible quota and the threat of execution, what did the local cadres do? They lied.
They falsified the harvest reports. They sent messages to the Ankar claiming that the glorious revolution had succeeded and the 3-ton quotas had been met or even exceeded.
And the central government, entirely insulated in Phnom Penh and blindingly faithful to their own ideology, believed these inflated numbers.
Based on these lies, the state arrived at the communes and confiscated the rice. They demanded the massive surplus they were promised. They loaded the grain onto trucks to be exported to China or diverted it to feed the Khmer Rouge military forces stationed on the borders.
The state took almost everything, leaving the communes with virtually nothing to survive on. The laborers who had spent 16 hours a day growing the food were left to starve.
Rations were systematically reduced from bowls of rice to a thin, watered-down rice porridge, often containing just a few actual grains of rice per person per day.
This created a massive, devastating, and entirely man-made famine across the most fertile land in Southeast Asia.
And the psychological cruelty of this environment is almost impossible to overstate. You have millions of people literally starving to death while standing knee-deep in rice paddies they had cultivated.
But the state maintained absolute control over the food supply as a weapon of compliance.
Survivor accounts frequently highlight the terror of foraging. If you are starving, human instinct drives you to find food. But the regime classified any independent attempt to gather food as private enterprise.
Picking a wild berry in the forest, catching a frog in an irrigation ditch, or hoarding a single piece of fruit to save a starving child. These acts were considered stealing from the Ankar.
And private enterprise, stealing from the collective, was a capital offense.
I want you to imagine the profound agony of that situation. Imagine watching your own child slowly starving to death, their body swelling from malnutrition.
You know that picking a piece of fruit from a nearby tree might give them a few more days of life, but you also know that if a child spy or a cadre sees you pick that fruit, you will be beaten to death with a hoe, leaving your child to die alone anyway.
The level of control the state exerted over the basic biological imperative to survive was absolute.
This silent, bureaucratic starvation was just as lethal, if not more so, than the execution squads. Hundreds of thousands of people simply wasted away.
And this death toll was massively exacerbated by the regime's xenophobic, anti-modern rejection of medicine. Because the ideology demanded total self-reliance, the regime completely refused to import Western medicines, viewing vaccines, antibiotics, and surgical equipment as corrupt capitalist conventions.
They destroyed the medical libraries. They either executed the country's trained doctors, recognizing them as intellectuals, or forced them to hide their identities and labor in the fields.
In the place of a modern medical system, the regime employed what were essentially child medics.
These were often teenagers, 12 to 15 years old, chosen purely for their perceived ideological purity and blind loyalty to the Ankar. They had absolutely no medical training, no understanding of anatomy, and no knowledge of hygiene.
They were instructed to rely on traditional, unproven remedies, like injecting patients with coconut water or using tree bark to treat malaria, or they conducted bizarre, horrific medical experiments, including amputations performed entirely without anesthesia.
Because of this deliberate destruction of healthcare, highly treatable diseases ripped through the weakened, malnourished population like wildfire. Thousands upon thousands died agonizing deaths from malaria, dysentery, and simple preventable infections.
And the regime didn't care. Their ideology regarding the individual was explicitly summarized in a terrifying, oft-repeated proverb: to keep you is no profit, to destroy you is no loss.
Human life had absolute zero value beyond its immediate daily utility to the state's agricultural goals.
But while the countryside was starving, dying of disease, and collapsing under the weight of impossible quotas, the regime's central leadership in Phnom Penh was growing increasingly paranoid.
The massive failure of their economic policies was undeniable, even to them. But in a totalitarian system built on absolute ideological purity, the ideology itself can never be acknowledged as flawed.
The leadership, Pol Pot, and his inner circle could not admit they were wrong. Therefore, the failure of the super great leap forward had to be the work of hidden enemies.
It had to be the result of a massive coordinated conspiracy of traitors, spies, and foreign saboteurs actively undermining the revolution.
This overwhelming paranoia required an industrial-scale mechanism to identify, extract, and eliminate these perceived internal threats. And that dark necessity leads us to the terrifying bureaucracy of S-21.
S-21, officially known as Security Prison 21, was the absolute heart of the Santabal, the Khmer Rouge's ruthless, secret police apparatus. The physical location of S-21 is deeply, darkly symbolic of the regime's entire philosophy.
It was originally a standard high school in Phnom Penh called Tul Sve Pre. The Khmer Rouge took a place designed for learning and enlightenment, wrapped the campus in layers of electrified barbed wire, and systematically converted the classrooms into tiny, brick-walled interrogation cells and torture chambers.
S-21 was commanded by a former mathematics teacher named King Geik Iv, who became known and feared as Comrade Dutch. The statistics that emerge from S-21 are a testament to its efficiency as a slaughterhouse.
Between 14,000 and 20,000 people were brought through the gates of this prison over 4 years. Out of all those thousands of men, women, and children, only about 7 to 12 adults are known to have survived. It was not a correctional facility, it was an extermination center.
But it is crucial to understand S-21 not merely as a dungeon, but as a highly organized, bureaucratic machine.
The people brought to S-21 were not, for the most part, the new people from the cities or petty criminals. They were predominantly high-ranking Khmer Rouge party cadres, military officers, diplomats, and their entirely innocent families.
As the agricultural economy collapsed, Pol Pot and the Central Committee began ruthlessly purging their own ranks, convinced that the party itself had been deeply infiltrated by agents of the CIA, the Soviet KGB, or the Vietnamese government.
The interrogation process at S-21 was designed with a specific, twisted logic. I think people assume torture is used to extract hidden truths.
Right.
But at S-21, the goal of the interrogation was not to discover the truth. The interrogators knew the prisoners were innocent of the absurd charges against them. The goal was to force the prisoner, through unspeakable, prolonged torture, to produce a detailed, fabricated confession that perfectly validated the Central Committee's paranoia.
Prisoners were subjected to horrific abuses, routine beatings, electric shocks, waterboarding, being suspended by their arms tied behind their backs until they broke.
They were forced to write their autobiographies over and over again, detailing every aspect of their lives since childhood. The interrogators would scrutinize these documents, looking for any minor inconsistency to use as proof of deception.
Eventually, broken by pain, the prisoners would confess to whatever absurd conspiracy the interrogator suggested. They would confess to being CIA agents despite not knowing what the CIA was. Crucially, they were forced to name their colleagues, friends, and subordinates as co-conspirators.
And those named individuals would then be arrested, brought to S-21, tortured until they named more people, continuously fueling an ever-expanding cannibalistic cycle of purges that devoured the party from the inside out.
But I want to ask you about something that seems deeply contradictory. Why was the regime so obsessed with meticulous record-keeping and photography, even as they were actively erasing their own citizens?
It is strange.
When the Vietnamese army eventually discovered S-21, they found that the Khmer Rouge had generated over 500,000 pages of documents. They photographed almost every single inmate upon arrival, staring blankly into the camera. If you are running a secret extermination camp and you are just going to murder everyone anyway, why dedicate so much time and resources to obsessively documenting it?
It highlights a dark, fundamental paradox of totalitarianism. That meticulous documentation, the thousands of mugshots, the hundreds of pages of forced autobiographies, the carefully signed and annotated confessions did not serve a judicial purpose. It served a vital psychological function for the regime's top leadership.
It created a massive, tangible paper trail of treason.
Exactly. By documenting the purification of the party so thoroughly, Pol Pot could point to the archives of S-21 and tell himself that the super great leap forward was failing, not because his voluntarist ideology was inherently flawed, but because there was a massive, documented, undeniable conspiracy of foreign agents actively sabotaging it.
The bureaucracy of death provided the necessary rationalization for their own devastating failures. They needed the paperwork to prove they were right to kill.
Once a prisoner at S-21 finally provided a satisfactory confession and named enough accomplices, their usefulness was over and their fate was sealed.
They were loaded onto covered trucks in the dead of night and driven to the final stop in this machinery of death, the killing fields. The most famous and thoroughly excavated of these sites is Chuang Ik, located about 15 kilometers outside of Phnom Penh.
The methods of mass execution employed at the killing fields reflect the regime's cold, calculating brutality and their obsession with economic efficiency. The Khmer Rouge considered bullets to be expensive and wasteful to use on traitors.
Therefore, victims were rarely shot. Instead, they were ordered to kneel by the edge of freshly dug trenches and were bludgeoned to death using heavy agricultural tools, pickaxes, hoes, machetes, and heavy iron bars.
The details from the few survivors who witnessed these sites and the forensic evidence gathered from the mass graves are haunting. To mask the screams of the victims and the sound of the bludgeoning from nearby villagers, the executioners set up loudspeakers powered by loud diesel generators, blasting revolutionary propaganda music and jarring nationalist songs into the night sky.
The cruelty extended to the absolute eradication of the victim's family line, adhering to the regime's chilling motto: to dig up the grass, one must remove the entire root. Babies and young children of the accused were not spared.
At Choang Ik, executioners murdered infants by smashing them against the trunk of a large tree, now known as the Chankiri tree, specifically to prevent them from growing up and seeking revenge for their parents' deaths.
Today, the Documentation Center of Cambodia has mapped out over 23,000 separate mass graves across the country. These graves contain the remains of over 1 million suspected victims of direct execution, entirely separate from the millions more who died of starvation and disease in the communes.
The sheer organized scale of these graves underscores that this was not random violence born of the chaos of war. It was a highly systematic, state-sponsored eradication program administered with chilling efficiency.
But as we look at this insular nightmare, it is vitally important to remember that this horror did not happen in a vacuum. Democratic Kampuchea was not an isolated island. The rise, the bloody reign, and the eventual fall of the Khmer Rouge were deeply, inextricably entangled in the broader geopolitical web of the Cold War.
Exactly. And it's crucial that we impartially examine the international involvement detailed in our historical sources, because the actions and strategic decisions of global superpowers played a massive, undeniable role in setting the stage for the Khmer Rouge to seize power.
Let's look at the catalyst of chaos leading up to the 1975 takeover. The historical record clearly documents the profound impact of the United States military actions in the region.
During the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Vietnam War was heavily spilling over its borders. The United States government, under the administration of Richard Nixon and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, authorized a massive, initially covert, carpet bombing campaign in neutral Cambodia, known under the code names Operation Menu and Operation Freedom Deal.
The strategic goal of the U.S. was to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the vital supply lines used by the North Vietnamese Army, and to eradicate Viet Cong sanctuaries that were hidden deep within Cambodian territory along the border.
The historical analyses in our sources, drawing heavily on the work of prominent historians like Ben Kiernan and David Chandler, indicate that while the bombing may have disrupted Vietnamese supply lines, it catastrophically destabilized rural Cambodian society.
The tonnage of bombs dropped on Cambodia actually exceeded the total tonnage dropped by the Allies during the entirety of World War II. It is estimated that between 50,000 and 150,000 Cambodian civilians were killed directly by the bombings.
This resulting devastation triggered a massive, unmanageable refugee crisis. Hundreds of thousands of terrified rural peasants fled the burning countryside, abandoning their farms and poured into the cities, particularly swelling the population of Phnom Penh.
This massive influx completely overwhelmed the fragile U.S.-backed Lon Nol government, causing massive inflation and food shortages. Crucially, the sources note that the Khmer Rouge leadership cynically but highly effectively utilized the devastation, the craters, and the civilian casualties from the U.S. bombings as incredibly potent recruitment propaganda.
They used the trauma to radicalize segments of the peasantry. They pointed to the sky and said, "The imperialists are destroying you. Join us to fight back." The bombing campaign essentially acted as an accelerant, swelling the ranks of the Khmer Rouge insurgency from a relatively small, marginal guerrilla force numbering only a few thousand into a hardened, fanatic army capable of capturing the entire country.
But while the U.S. bombing inadvertently fueled their rise by providing chaos and recruits, the Khmer Rouge received their primary, intentional, and sustaining backing from another global superpower.
The historical record is entirely unambiguous. The Chinese Communist Party, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, provided immense, vital, and continuous support to Pol Pot's regime.
The CCP was the absolute main international patron of democratic Kampuchea. It is estimated that a staggering 90% of all foreign aid the Khmer Rouge received came directly from China. In 1975 alone, the year they took power, China provided an estimated $1 billion in interest-free economic and military aid.
That financial backing was the lifeline that allowed the regime to attempt its radical economic experiments. And the support was not just financial, it was deeply ideological and logistical.
The sources detail that China supplied more than 15,000 military and technical advisors to Cambodia. These advisors helped maintain the minimal infrastructure the regime allowed to exist.
Pol Pot and other senior Khmer Rouge leaders traveled to Beijing in 1975, where they met with Mao Zedong himself. Mao reportedly gave Pol Pot his personal approval and advice, validating the extreme speed of their revolution. High-ranking CCP officials even traveled to Cambodia to observe the communes and provide specialized training on conducting political purges and managing class conflict.
Why did China support such a visibly destructive regime? It comes down to cold, strategic geopolitics. The Chinese government viewed Pol Pot's hyper-nationalist regime as a crucial, necessary strategic bulwark against the expanding influence of the Soviet Union, and more specifically, the Soviet Union's primary regional ally, Vietnam.
China wanted a hostile state on Vietnam's western border to keep them contained, which brings us directly to the violent end of the regime.
The Khmer Rouge's extreme inward-looking xenophobia, their belief in their own racial and ideological superiority, eventually led to their own destruction. They didn't just target their own people for extermination. They launched highly aggressive, unprovoked purges against ethnic minorities, particularly ethnic Vietnamese living in Cambodia.
Furthermore, driven by a desire to reclaim the borders of the ancient Khmer Empire, the Khmer Rouge military initiated a series of incredibly violent border skirmishes and massacres inside Vietnamese territory.
They poked a much larger, much better equipped bear. After years of these incursions and tired of the massacres of Vietnamese citizens along the border, Vietnam responded with overwhelming military force.
In December 1978, the battle-hardened Vietnamese military, heavily supplied and supported by the Soviet Union, launched a massive full-scale invasion of Cambodia.
The Khmer Rouge forces, exhausted from starvation and decimated by internal purges, collapsed almost immediately. By January 7, 1979, Vietnamese forces captured Phnom Penh, effectively toppling the democratic Kampuchea regime and forcing Pol Pot, his inner circle, and the surviving Khmer Rouge military forces to flee westward, deep into the malarial jungles along the Thai border.
When the Vietnamese army entered the country, they uncovered the killing fields. They found S-21. The international press was finally allowed in, and the world saw the mass graves in the mountains of skulls.
You would naturally assume that the discovery of this genocide, the undeniable revelation that a quarter of a nation's population had been systematically murdered by its own government, would instantly unite the world in condemnation and a demand for justice.
But the sources detail a deeply tragic, almost sickening irony of the Cold War aftermath. Despite the undeniable photographic evidence of the genocide, the rigid geopolitical alignments of the Cold War dictated the international response.
Because it was the Vietnamese army allies of the Soviet Union who had invaded and ousted the Khmer Rouge, the Western Bloc and China viewed the new government in Phnom Penh as a Soviet puppet state.
Therefore, simply to counter Soviet influence in Southeast Asia, a coalition of countries, including the United States, China, and Thailand, continued to officially recognize the deposed, genocidal Khmer Rouge as the sole legitimate government of Cambodia.
It is a dark stain on international diplomacy. The Khmer Rouge, operating as a government in exile from hidden bases in the jungles, receiving covert aid to fight the Vietnamese, was actually allowed to retain Cambodia's seat at the United Nations General Assembly until 1993.
The international community, driven by Cold War chess, effectively shielded the architects of the genocide for over a decade. It took many decades for the international community to finally establish tribunals to hold the surviving leaders accountable.
And the ultimate architect, Pol Pot himself, died peacefully under house arrest in his jungle compound in 1998, never having faced a formal international trial, never having spent a single day in a prison cell for the deaths of 2 million people.
As we try to synthesize the overwhelming, crushing weight of this history, the tragedy of democratic Kampuchea stands as a terrifying, definitive clinical study.
It shows us exactly what happens when absolute ideological purity, driven by an arrogant, unyielding belief that society can be engineered from scratch, becomes state policy.
The Khmer Rouge believed they could build a perfect agrarian utopia by erasing every single thing that made their citizens human. Instead, they built a vast, silent graveyard.
The mechanisms of this genocide, the slow bureaucratic starvation, the paranoid criminalization of the intellect, the meticulous, obsessive documentation of torture to justify failure demonstrate a terrifying truth.
The greatest, most catastrophic atrocities in human history are often committed not in a sudden frenzy of chaotic violence, but through cold, administrative order. The Khmer Rouge dismantled the pillars of society methodically, one by one, proving that civilization and the morality that binds it is far more fragile than we ever care to admit.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering question to ponder long after we finish speaking today. We have spent this hour examining how a regime successfully targeted and destroyed the very building blocks of human connection.
They weaponized children against parents, they destroyed the trust between neighbors, they criminalized the shared history of a culture, and they eradicated the basic empathy required to sustain a community.
When a nation is subjected to that level of absolute systemic erasure, when the hard drive is truly wiped clean, how does a society ever begin to rebuild a shared consciousness from absolute zero?
It is a profound generational challenge. Rebuilding the physical infrastructure, the roads, the hospitals, the schools, is difficult, but it is a matter of engineering.
But healing the psychological landscape of a society where children were actively taught to betray their parents and where survival required absolute, terrified silence, that is a wound that takes centuries to heal.
It really is.
Thank you for joining us for this difficult but entirely necessary deep dive.